So, in 1839, an official in King China by the name of Lin de would write a letter to Queen Victoria accusing Britain of moral bankruptcy. The most famous line of that letter is, "Suppose foreigners came to sell opium in England. Would you not deeply hate it?" Lin de wrote this letter because for nearly 100 years at this point, China had repeatedly banned opium and declared it a national crisis. But Britain refused to stop flooding China with opium, and eventually would turn to violence, just like a modern drug cartel, to enforce this drug trade. The Opium Wars, as they would come to be known, were one of the most evil acts in history. Its intention was to collapse the Qing dynasty so that Britain could usher in colonialism into mainland China. But ironically, this would directly lead to the rise of communist China. But we'll get to that at the end. So, in the 1730s, Britain wants to colonize China. But how? China, even then, is like a massive, powerful country, even if it couldn't match Britain's firepower. So Britain had to turn to chemical and economic warfare. This is where they get the idea to start smuggling opium into China to destabilize it. Because at this point, India has been controlled by the East India Company, the big British precursor to corporate capitalism, and they're running the show in India, and they have access to tons, literally tons of opium. And they decide to deliberately start smuggling it into China, despite repeated bans by the Qing dynasty. And this goes on from about, exactly 1729 to 1831, so over 100 years. The plan was to create mass addiction in China, drain China's coffers, and destabilize the empire so the British can move in and basically do what they did in India. But China, of course, fights back, and they introduce laws that completely outlaw opium in every single way. Like, it is a death sentence to go anywhere near opium as a Chinese citizen. So the British go, how are we going to get around this? And they basically set up a drug cartel. The East India Company, in fact, will lead this, and they start bribing Chinese officials to let them just start sending shipments of opium and set up smuggling networks all over the country to, again, just flood the place with opium. This will be the provocation for the First Opium War, which is 1839 to 1842. After China basically catches one of these smuggling rigs, it's like 20,000 chests of British opium. They find it and they destroy it. And the British frame this as an act, like a violation of free trade, and they're basically saying this is terrorism against Britain. Does that sound familiar? Anyway, they're thinking, hey, if we start a war here, maybe we can just get a shortcut to colonizing the place anyway. So this war goes on for a few years and eventually leads to the Treaty of Nanjing, which forces China to cede Hong Kong to Britain and forces China to pay massive indemnities. So this will, of course, then directly lead to the Second Opium War because this is a massively unfair treaty, and understandably, a lot of Chinese people are very angry about it. And now that Britain has a mainland port, Hong Kong, the island of China, they can really flood the place with opium. And the British figure they can use this as an opportunity to expand this. And then there's this event called the Arrow Incident, which is basically China refuses registration of one of the British ships that is known for transporting opium. And the British go, well, that's as good a pretext for war as any. And of course, they declare war on China again. And this time they drag France into it as well, because they're like, hey, France, you want to get one of these treaty ports? They're really good. And in exchange, the French Navy can come and help them do this. And eventually they'll invade Beijing itself. They will loot and burn the old Summer Palace, and they will steal like heaps of artifacts from the palace and from Beijing itself. Most famously, there's these bronze zodiac heads which are stolen, and they're still in the British Museum to this day. Anyway, so after this second war, it leads to the Treaty of Tianjin. This is 1858, and it forces China to legalize opium. Like this, and that's game over. Like, this entrenches the addiction, and it's basically just poisoning all of China. And this is one of the biggest destabilizing things that ever happens to China. This is the end of all of the dynasties. And so this will lead to Britain then imposing what they call the most favored nations clause into China. And it basically allows all the Western powers to just do whatever they want to these Chinese ports. Everyone's grabbing a slice. Russians, the Germans, everyone's grabbing trade ports or treaty ports. And this will lead to the beginning of colonial entrenchment into mainland China. Britain will expand Hong Kong's territory through what they call the 99-year lease. And this will, and this is in 1898, and it will go until 1997 when Hong Kong is finally returned to China. I remember when that happened, by the way. Anyway, would lead to the total destabilization of China, and again, the collapse of the Qing dynasty. And this will usher in a new nightmare for China, because at the same time this is happening, Japan is watching what's going on in China and they're thinking, we don't want this to happen to us. We see what these Western powers are like. So if we don't want to be invaded by Britain, we have to show we're tough. So Japan heads down the course then of becoming a colonial power itself. And again, I think you can directly blame Britain for this, but that's my opinion. And this will lead to the First Sino-Japanese War in 1894, which will be a stunning victory for Japan, again, because China is devastated from everything that's been happening for the last 150 years with Britain. And Japan will start stamping up colonies too. They'll take Taiwan, they will take heaps from China, which ultimately would lead to everything that happens in World War II. In fact, that's why when I started this, I said, these opium wars will directly lead to the rise of communist China. And that's because in the 40s, the second Sino-Japanese War will break out. And Japan's like, we can just start taking more Chinese land. They are so weak. The whole country, the Qing dynasty has fallen. Nationalist China is a fraction of what China used to be. There's warlords all over the Chinese mainland. We can just pick them off one by one. But one of those groups that that Japan thinks they can take down is led by Mao Zedong, which is the Communist Chinese. And this will lead to the United Front in China against Japan, and that fighting will weaken the strongest group in China at the time, which is the Nationalist Chinese group led by Chiang Kai-shek. And eventually, this will lead to the collapse of Nationalist China and the rise of Communist China, which is, of course, the China we know today. So it's interesting that what started as a very myopic, very selfish, basically capitalist colonialist endeavor by Britain to conquer China and bring it into the fold like they did to India would end up long-term having the exact opposite effect. It would lead to the rise of communism in China and turn China into, at least in my opinion, the strongest country in the world today. And you can directly thank British colonialism for that happening. Anyway, I just all think that's very, very interesting. And hopefully this has given you something to think about.